Any friend of the APICS body of knowledge will be familiar with the extended enterprise. APICS discusses the supply chain maturity or evolution model, going from stage 1, multiple dysfunction, to stage 4, extended enterprise. The main emphasis is organizations need to work beyond their operational boundaries by sharing and collaborating with trading partners. The stage 4 extended enterprise is just that, when at least one business process goes beyond the boundary of the individual corporation. As I did more research into the history of the supply chain evolution concept, I ran across an article, Strategic Control in the Extended Enterprise, from January 1993, written by Dr. Benn Konsynski. What I can gather, this is one of, if not the very first reference to the extended enterprise. It all sounds pretty boring, so let's see if Dr. Konsynski can prove me wrong. This brings me to today at Emory University, where I'm sitting with Dr. Benn Konsynski to get his insight on extended enterprises, along with other things. Dr. Benn Konsynski has been a professor at Emory for over 25 years, following a stint as faculty at Harvard Business School, where he taught in the MBA program and for several executive programs. Prior to arriving at HBS, he was a professor at the University of Arizona, where he was a co-founder of the university's multi-million-dollar group decision support laboratory. He holds a PhD in computer science from Purdue University. Dr. Benn, thank you for speaking with me. I expect you could talk for hours about many things, but let's start with the article I referenced earlier, Strategic Control in the Extended Enterprise. I know it was written a long time ago, but why did you write the article to begin with?
Thank you for asking. The article was reflecting my work. I've done a lot of work in interorganizational systems, how systems across organizational boundaries transform practice, which was one of the main reasons why I went to Harvard. That I was doing work on interorganizational systems, and I could see no better forum or venue to look at that than at Harvard. My background from a technology standpoint, looking at systems that stretch across organizational boundaries, leads us to question and challenge how the intra-organizational view of the enterprise operates. And I find that I could test CIOs and IT leaders, in part by getting them to understand what the scope of their enterprise systems are, and to find that the ones that are rich had a view of an extended enterprise that look at systems beyond the organizational boundaries. I knew if they only talked about the assets they owned, that they had a very shallow discussion of what the enterprise is or could be. And so it was clear to me that those that thought as an extended enterprise would look at not only the assets they own, but the assets they control and influence, and the assets external that influence them. And so it's a part of looking at the individual enterprise reaching out into the market and its interface and the ecosystem of technology that they leverage, but also then it's the bridge over to my interorganizational systems work to look at how the systems across organizational boundaries change things. Where does my company end and your company begin, for example? When I start linking into your inventory systems to make judgments and influence and create orders, that it's difficult to say where my company ends and yours begins when I have a visibility that is in itself a influence across the organizations.
Yeah, it's interesting that, so the article was over, 26 years ago or so, and that's really, computers were around then, but it was still early days of computing. So you're a big visionary back then.
Well, I began working on interorganizational systems in the 80s. So in the mid-80s, was a Harvard Business Review article that I did on IS redrawing organizational boundaries, and other articles in the academic stream looking at systems across organizations. So the computer systems and information sharing and commitments, and certainly make those bridges more than just systems. I've always been involved with the EDI, the Electronic Data Interchange System, since those elements began with the TDCC Standards on in the transportation arena, looking at our standards that we use for electronic data interchange. And it always occurred to me that there's a lot more than electronic data interchange there's going on here. It's exchanging commitments and trust basis, and the business element was being neglected with the perception of a procedural element on it. It's not just systems, it's commitments and contracts, agreements. And that's why when you bring it forward into today, why areas are important to me as smart contracting and looking at supply chains that have extraordinarily smart elements and completion of obligations within the supply chain itself without human intervention.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're hitting on all the key words. I mean, from an APICS body of knowledge, Ben, I mean, that EDI is a core concept. That's what they teach. And the key thing for effective collaboration even today is trust, and that's what you said. I know a lot of it depends on the ability to communicate data electronically, but if organizations don't have the trust in the partnerships, it doesn't work well.
Right, and I sort of lived through that whole evolution with the TDCC standards coming into the X12 structures. I was on the board of one of the pioneers in the service and provisioning in that arena called Harbinger here, that was based here in Atlanta. And we were the first ones to look at EDI over the internet. Another company in California named Priminous was also doing that. And we actually merged, we acquired Priminous into Harbinger and started the leading on the domain of EDI over internetworking arenas, not just through the VAN services as a part of it. So looking at different pathways, because you have to have a high reliability, a high confidence in that messaging exchange. It's a part of the basis of trust. And so many things advance today on elements of a basis of trust in creating it. And hence our cryptocurrencies, our distributed ledger technologies, all the blockchain elements are all a part of technologies that support the business function of trust.
So we're referring to an article from about 26 years ago, but from my understanding, Ben, you've been doing computing for what, 50 years?
52 years ago, I started in computing in Explorer Scouts when I was in high school, and never left that domain. So I've been working with computers from those as big as these rooms we're in, and to those that are smaller than hopefully insertable, expected to be inserted into brains.
Sure, yeah, I remember I told you the story of when I was in college. I thought it was a big disruption when I had to actually go to a computer center and type into a dummy computer and then get a printout. And then you were telling me about the cards even before then.
Yeah, it was fortunate. We had the Standard Oil of Indiana. I was in Hammond, Gary, Indiana area, grew up there, and the Standard Oil of Indiana supported the Explorer Scouts by allowing them access to these extraordinarily expensive $90,000, $100,000 a month computers. And it was fantastic. It certainly set us on a seed towards looking at building systems and planning systems.
So today, I mean, it's popular for the younger generation, Ben, to be interested in computing. Obviously, schools are preaching STEM. You see Google Amazon, Microsoft in the news all the time, so it's almost a popularity thing to be in computing. But, back then it wasn't so popular. How did you get involved in computing?
Well, that work from the Explorer Scouts was sort of set me on a path to looking at technologies changing what's possible. And so my quests have always been looking at transforming what is possible. And that certainly it could have led into strictly on the science side and my computer science background, but I've always been in the bridge of commerce and practice. So whether it's been through the university positions where I've always been anchored in the business school, but complementary or cross-association with the computer science programs, as well as working in practice, I've always had the bridge over to practice, and that's why my interest in consulting. I've spent a lot of time with AT&T, with IBM, with UPS, and others through the years that have offered venues to educate me as well.
Yeah, you mentioned commerce, and that's where really IT computing ties into supply chain. Supply chain is basically, if it wasn't for people buying things, you wouldn't need a supply chain. That's what I tell people all the time.
Well, it's been about focuses on the movement of assets, but a lot of the skills in supply chain is planning not to move assets, and certainly your financial benefits. Every one of our systems is about two things. It's about asset management and event management. And supply chains are no exception to that. In fact, they are an obvious element in it. We move things to make them still in a distribution center. We move things to that should not necessarily be moved or don't have to be moved. We get into drop ship or direct ship activities that change some of the nature of our historic distribution. And so the supply chain being smart has great effect on the economics of operations. And we can make them smarter. We can make them smarter and find new ways of assessing arrangements that allow us to move bits so we don't have to move atoms.
Yeah, it's interesting your perspective. You say supply chain is asset management and event management. That actually makes a lot of sense. I tell people I just help move boxes more efficiently. Pretty much that's what my role is in the supply chain. But from an event management standpoint, that's especially true today. People want to see what's happening, maybe what didn't happen, so they get a chance to maybe react or proactively plan around specific events.
And certainly for supply chains, visibility has been a critical element. But visibility should lead to other forms of arrangements that allow you to share assets, move assets. Inventory might better be served in motion than at rest, and other things like that allow us to rethink the association of moving atoms.
Sure. So you were around kind of in the whole evolution of computing. I mean, you've probably seen it all, from the Bill Gates, the Microsofts, the Apples, everything starting up.
From the business application side, I've also been involved significantly since not the first stage, but the second stage of the building of the Internet. And I worked on gateway systems between the local area networks and the IMPs, the Internet Message Processors. So I've watched that evolution as well. And certainly in the 70s and early 80s, the only folks that were operating on the Internet were the military and researchers and academics. And in the late 80s, you saw the library folks come on with and documents with systems called Gopher space that were about movement of files and so forth. But Tim Berners-Lee and the introduction of the World Wide Web made it much democratized accessibility and democratized sharing. So for the most part, it was document sharing assets and messaging. We were doing messaging all over the world in the late 70s and early 80s from an academic standpoint. We were electronically integrated in those areas. So I watched that evolution. The 1995 to me is a pivot, a strong pivot point, because the year began. You have the World Wide Web coming out in '91, and I have even screen captures and videos of things we did here at Emory in 1993. But 95 was, to me, the year that business caught on to the Internet. That at the beginning of the year, Microsoft and Bill Gates put out a book called The Road Ahead. And he had one chapter, I think it was chapter number 7, that was about business and computing. And it was mentioned in there that business computing could have a strong impact. By the end of that year, they completely rewrote the book. Microsoft bet the farm on Internet Explorer and the Internet, and others transformed. The Netscape IPO happened in August. That literally was your first IPO of an internet company that set things off. I did some work with a small a company in the mid 1995, and on SOB, student of Benn. One of my students was a number 3. He was actually the number 1 employee after the founders at a company, and had issues with how to monetize. They had support. Sugar daddies were running out of money and patience on there, so they were going to lose it. They had to find ways to monetize their services, and they were very popular. And when we called around to look at how the information services might be sold, the marketing people said, "No way, I'm going to do advertising on this thing called the Internet. We're not going to spend money on that thing." And you could do data services. So the company had some runway for 6 or 7 months, and at the end, he wanted to pay me, and I said, "No, don't worry, I don't charge SOBs, students of Benn." And what I should have said is, "You guys are going down the tube. You should give me a big pile of that equity, that garbage you call equity, and as it's not going to be worth anything." Well, it turned out about 7 months later, this was Yahoo IPO'd.
Yahoo?
Yes, and had I thought differently and echoed, then you would be talking on my island right now rather than in my office here.
Wow, that's great. Well, so I didn't know, was Atlanta big into the internet space? I know Hayes Computing was here, and then Earthlink started here, and I don't know if those.
Oh yeah, certainly there are many, and one of the things I was pleased in coming here in 1993, or 92 actually, the activity, especially around communications. I had done a lot of work in media and communications, and I'd done a lot of work with AT&T, and so from a communication standpoint, that Atlanta was a hub. Post-production in video was huge here. Dennis Hayes and others that had a strong impact, and certainly on controlling messaging in routing systems and communications. So there were a lot of seeds of really interesting stuff going on here at the time. So at first I was a bit apprehensive in the environment. I expected I would be leveraging my West Coast, East Coast connections, relying on those, but actually it's a great sandbox here.
Yeah, it's as I said, I just see the news and I know of all the history of what's going on around Atlanta. A lot of great minds, including yourself. So what have you been working on lately? I mean, since the invention of the internet.
Well, actually, ironically, right now I'm involved with Vint Cerf, who is credited with most often the singular person credited with the invention of the internet, because he led the TCP/IP standards that and protocols that we still use today. involved with him in looking at people-centered internet and trying to invert and transform the internet evolution into an element that serves people more than it has been in its recent trends in there as well. But I am most interested in the nexus of and convergence of technologies. So I deal a lot with augmented reality, virtual worlds, full immersion technologies. I deal a lot with AI in terms of cognitive computing, and that merges not only machine learning and deep learning, which unfortunately to me, so many people associate singularly with AI, but I think it's a very limited scope on it. But looking at high-dimensional math models that offer not black boxes but transparent boxes, and that give you managing complexity, and semantic models, ontologies, where you bring knowledge of domains into it. And I participate with a company called Intera Solutions that is Princeton and Newtown, Pennsylvania based, that is truly a cognitive computing that mixes all those elements together, and in looking at approaching cognitive approaches to bringing elements of structured and unstructured analysis into enterprises and extended enterprises.
And you're on the board of still some large corporations? Or?
Well, I'm on the board of a public company called Tesco Technologies with Wireless Equipment Arena, and I've spent a lot of time in wireless evolution. I mentioned Harbinger, and after Harbinger was sold, a group got together here in Atlanta, created NuBridges, and NuBridges worked on a lot of those, the very similar elements on data synchronization across organizations, and that was acquired by Liaison Technologies, which grew out of the forest products domain. And the thing I'm proud of is also that the CIO, CFO, and CTO of Liaison were SOBs.
SOBs.
I'm very proud of my the students of Benn that are influencing a lot of things in the markets.
So you've mentioned that a couple of times. What is an SOB?
Some years ago, after I arrived here and dealt with my Harvard alumni connects, many of them here and others, and the Emory alumni were starting to come out as well, that I wanted a means of mingling those together that created a community of folks that were actually students of Benn that had been involved, but also offer the label to anybody who's been for one of my any teaching program or our group program as well. So I am interested in supporting any of those folks that are absolutely interested in interesting things.
Well, I guess you're in a unique position to be able to influence a lot of people's lives, both professionally as well, probably maybe personally. So that's an interesting space to be. And it sounds like you like to maintain those relationships. I know I follow you on Twitter. And what's your handle? SOB World, is that?
Yeah, SOB World. I set up to mainly deal with communications of new technology news items of interest to my current students or recent alumni, and so it's mainly a channel to that you don't get in something like Facebook or LinkedIn that are fairly diffuse. This would be sort of a one-stop shop for things that I curate myself and that I think are of interest, that anyone curious about technology transforming commerce or society.
So are you a continuous learner? You still
forever. The first thing I'll say in class is the last thing I'll say in class, and that is never grow up. And I feel that all too often there are too many of our elements of education and training and pressures in corporation and life that try to get people to grow up. And I've seen a lot of old young people, and instead they should be young and even through being old.
So Ben, are you still actively teaching at Emory, or?
Oh yes, of course. I just finished a class actually 2 weeks ago. Here, even in the summertime, and I had 4 classes this last spring. Privacy in the Digital Age, joint with the law school. So the entire class were second and third year law students, as well as business school students, BBA, MBA, and also JD MBAs, also that look at privacy issues in the digital age. I teach jointly with a colleague who's a scholar in the Fourth Amendment, and so he and I work together on that class to look at those issues, because privacy mechanisms in the U.S. are based and anchored on the Fourth Amendment rights.
Okay. So somebody could actually, if they wanted to be an SOB, could they take a one-off class at Emory?
Absolutely.
So they could check out the website and sign up.
Yeah, I have a class in the fall called Appcology that deals with the ecology of apps and IoT, IoE, machine-to-machine. They design chatbots. They'll work on machine learning and deep learning. It's very much hands-on. I tell them they leave with a portfolio, not a certificate. And one of the things I know, and certainly that I tell my students, is that how you think is more important than what you know. And especially in the domain of technology, where the what you know is ephemeral and changes quite radically over time. How you think is what you preserve across 50 years of volatility. And so we keep giving lip service to that change, but especially if you want a horizon. Most frequently, the focus tends to be on very short horizons, 2-year, 5-year horizons. I make them do 20-year horizons. And because I think how you stretch out is a very important element in there. And getting a running start. CEOs, and I test with them, the people that say, here's where we are, here's where are we going, are very poor predictors of the future. And the one you get a running start on it. So I'm interested in what I call yesterday's tomorrows, what people of yesterday thought tomorrow would be like, and where they blew it, where they how they overshot or how they undershot, and how do we create a mechanism that allows us to narrow that prediction. And I've been involved with that through the years, from even Apple Knowledge Navigator, if you look at that from 1988 as prediction of, I believe we pinned the history as September 16th, 2011. That was that we made in at that time, and I did not make it. It was a marketing group, but I was working with the Apple ATG, the Advanced Technology Group, and we were critiquing the prediction of the future. I thought it was actually, it holds out very well as a predictor.
Well, it sounds like you almost don't have time to teach, Ben, with everything that's going on.
I blend in what I'm doing with what I'm teaching, and so I think it helps people get a running start on their own future.
And back to what you're working on today, you mentioned bots. Do you do anything in the drone space?
Yes, actually, I'm very interested in drones. I'm interested in drones and have been for some time now, in part because of the issue of autonomy. And so whether it's a terrestrial vehicle and driverless cars, or whether it's into the drone technology, I have segments of my class that are called letting go. and how we decide and when we give authority to let go of a decision right or control that we have. I asked them what year it's going to be when you open a door for your Uber and there's no driver there. You're shocked now. At what point, when you open the door and you see a person there, you say, "Oh darn."
No, it's disappointing. Yeah.
And you get more concerned. I also asked them, who do you want landing the plane, the pilot or the avionics system? And almost universally they'll say they want the pilot landing. Yet they know statistically that 90+% of all landing accidents have pilot error as an element in it. And we didn't let the pilots land the space shuttle. We were flying it as well.
Good point.
But we have to decide when we let go of those things, and we're testing those waters now with the terrestrial, automobiles and trucks as well. Trucking, we have a huge problem in the U.S. Growing, where we're going to have to move to autonomous vehicles. So I have a segment of my classes on the road to autonomy, and how we move into a spot where we are willing to let go of right and authority. We suffer a system now that kills 37,000 of our citizens every year in the automobile. And yes, we'll celebrate it's down from the 40s, but it's still untenable that we tolerate that. As we would not design a system from scratch and say, well, we're going to lose 37,000 people every year, and yet we do. And so we have to do something down the road. And I'm engaged with some of the drone delivery of medicine, and certainly looking in Rwanda and others, where you have fixed wing aircraft that can, Zipline and others that deliver goods, and looking at maternal mortality issues in Kenya, where working with Google Loon in looking at provisioning Wi-Fi accessibility, because you have women that actually will walk 4 or 5 hours to go give birth because they don't have medical care in proximity, and putting lives at risk, their lives at risk, and their child's at risk.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting that what you talked about, the Rwanda, that I show that video in one of our APICS classes about, I think the company's called Zipline. It's a fixed aircraft and how it works and delivers.
Yeah, and UPS has been a strong partner with Zipline in Rwanda in their supply setup to deliver, and has been a very good partner with them.
Sure. Yeah, I saw UPS recently did a medical delivery in North Carolina. I think it was last year, I saw that on the news as well. So you stay active. You're pretty involved in the community as well. I think I see you involved with different associations locally. I'm looking over your shoulder and I see the TEDx Emory. What is that? What is that all about?
Well, certainly the TEDx programs are prevalent around the country. We at Emory are very fortunate in that we have one of the very few large seat licenses. They're usually licensed by seating capacity, and we have the largest license in the Southeast that allows and it's student run. I'm a faculty advisor for it, one of the 2 faculty advisors for that group, and we run our program every February. I encourage people to go to TEDxemory.org and take a look at some of our speakers. We're in our 8th year in doing this, and have amazing folks that share ideas. And so it's a TED program in the TEDx distributed spirit.
And your next event?
Would be next February.
You said February, okay. And you're doing other things around town. I see EEVM. What is?
Yeah, Emory's has a venture group that is Emory-wide. It's not just business school. That holds the largest hackathon in the Atlanta area as well. That Hack ATL. That is we've had is 450 folks registered in and do a weekend hackathon where we'll start on Friday and end on Sunday and have presentations and contests and so forth. I'm involved with ETH ATL, which is Ethereum, in the crypto side, an Ethereum hackathon related to smart contracting. And that's a September-October event that we use, and certainly those hackathons are exercises in getting people to not only think about things but build things, and I'm always encouraged by doing that. I always hold my I have in my classes a end of my even at the execs I have a session called Hold My Beer that where they get to demonstrate some of the projects they've done with Arduino, Raspberry Pis, or building chat bots and other things like that. I want them to do something, not just talk about it.
Interesting. Yeah, so we, in the supply chain space, we have you made me think about the beer game. It talks about the bullwhip effect. And to be politically correct, I think they had to change it to the lemonade game. But that's what made me think about your whole
even when I was at Harvard, I helped bring the beer game over in the operations group.
Sure.
In the good heavens, that would be in the late 80s.
Yeah, it's a good hands-on experiential exercise of
absolutely
of the bullwhip, which is kind of what APICS teaches against. And that brings us back to that's why companies need extended enterprises to be able to communicate and not depend on forecasts, but actually depend on end customer demand. That's the whole concept.
I think it comes back to that critical principle of looking at, from the enterprise standpoint, is their horizon beyond what they own, and looking at the assets and systems that they interact with. Most companies that had started on development with a development focus and skills around development are moved into integration. So our staffing is less about development than it is about integration. It's less about CapEx than it is about OpEx. And so more and more you have to, by necessity, look at an ecosystem that extends beyond your enterprise and therefore also involves integration with market facilitators or business partners.
This is fantastic. I could listen to this all day. So as we wrap down, Ben, I appreciate you investing the time with us. Just one thing I always try to give listeners is anybody that's maybe entering college or even possibly looking at a career change, any advice maybe from a professorial standpoint?
We live in a remix era. The skills that folks need going forward, and I think most millennials and Gen Z are attuned to this, probably better attuned than the Gen X and boomers are, to building a portfolio of skills. YOLO to them means you only live once. To me, it means your life is over. But to those groups in the remix era, the aspiration should be achieving the portfolio of experiences, just as they do in the social life, and a focus on collection of experiences rather than assets. The same thing is true on skills. Most of them know that the job they're going to have 5 to 10 years from now doesn't exist, and they have an opportunity to shape it or make it, and therefore they need to build a portfolio of skills that they can use to assemble and create that. And the old ideas of firm career paths and structured career skill sets is gone, as far as I'm concerned. That if I was a youth right now, I want to bring the broad mix. If I wanted to learn, I teach a course called Think.Code.Make. And it's for the undergraduates, and many of them are noobs. So it's a course for noobs to nerds. And yet at the same time, it's about thinking. You learn to code to think, not to be a coder. They're not going to be coders, but they learn to code to think. And I really want folks to get into making and the making experience. So they also make things as well in doing that. And you see this pattern of people with music backgrounds, for example, are well trained, and I encourage anybody to have a liberal arts and a background as well. When you're designing chatbots, I don't need more tech people. I need more liberal arts people. I'm designing a conversation, not designing a program. And so in many of our systems that it takes a mix of skills. And many of the young folks that I see winning are those that are bringing a extraordinary and unique mix of skills together to do something that wouldn't be done otherwise.
Sure. That's an interesting concept. I've often heard, and it's probably more prevalent today, that the only constant is change. And do you think I haven't been in a freshman class for a long time, but will computing become like just part of a core requirement, like economics or accounting?
We work with high schools and middle schools, and I think they're working very hard on that. The course that I'm talking about, called Think.Code.Make, I hope 5 years from now doesn't need to exist, because the students will be coming in with that.
Yeah.
So or at least it'll stretch itself into more nerdy than newbie.
Sure.
And whereas right now it's probably more noob than nerd.
Well, thanks again, Ben. Is there anything that you want to wrap up with? Any ideas you want to share before we conclude?
No, I think to me the 21st century is about reallocating decision rights and authorities. If I want to take a macro trend, it is this century is about reallocating decision rights and authorities. And that is to individuals and corporations stop trying to fix the 20th century and start working on building the 21st century.
And the thing that I picked up on, Ben, from you was how you think is more important than what you know. I think that's a good theme. A good theme for our discussion. Well, thanks again, Ben. Referencing back to the APICS body of knowledge, the stages of supply chain integration or maturity follow 4 stages. Stage 1, baseline, multiple dysfunction, or reactive. Stage 2, functional integration, semi-functional enterprise, or reactive efficient. Stage 3, internal integration, integrated enterprise, or proactive efficient. And Stage 4, external integration, extended enterprise, or strategic driver. If you're interested in learning more about this model and how you can improve your supply chain, consider getting an APICS supply chain certification for yourself or for your team. And remember, supply chain is boring.